And here we are for part 3 in Emotions and Prejudice. Penelope's still with us, hanging out here. So another feeble attempt at some humor, stereotypes, emotions, moods. I found this on the net. Obviously, we'll find most stuff. Stereotypes that never caught on. I thought it was pretty funny. Oh, those damn Jews and those Jews in their damn semaphore. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It's not something we observe. Gordon Allport said that all stereotypes typically contain a kernel of truth, but then it's widely exaggerated, widely misinterpreted, and widely misapplied from that point on. So there might be at some core, and this is really poking fun at the idea because there's no core, no kernel of truth in any of these. Like, can't keep Spaniards away from nuclear testing. Well, that would be a stereotype, but it's an inaccurate one, right? Or you know how black girls are about taxidermy, and you go, like, what? No, I don't, right? So without a kernel of truth, then the stereotypes descend into absurdity. How do you guys feel like celebrating some Ohio State successes here? About time we do that. And you know, I talk a lot about research that's generated in Ohio State, and there's a couple reasons. One, I'm amazingly familiar with it. Two, we're Buckeyes, and I think we deserve the credit as leaders in research across the world, especially when it comes to attitudes and when it comes to stereotypes. We are one of the top generators of research findings and theorizing in those areas. Remember, the psychology department was 1907 that started. So we're now 113 years of psychology at Ohio State, and that's a rich history and a huge body of publications, ideas, and a huge number of researchers who devoted their lives to these ideas. I want to talk here about hedonic contingency, and many of you maybe have had a class now with Dr. Wagner, so there he is, Dwayne Wagner. And this is research he did when he was a graduate student. Yes, he was a graduate student in Ohio State social psychology before he left, right? He graduated, got his PhD, he went to Purdue, did his work there, and years later, at being Purdue, he came back. And the funny thing is, in Ohio State social psychology, we see a lot of people who go in the social psychology program, they earn their PhD, they go away to teach at another university, which is almost an expectation or a requirement, but then they come back sooner or later. So Dwayne has left and he rejoined us. What can I say about Dwayne? He's got a rich research career, and let's look. This hedonic contingency he began with Rich Petty, and many of you know Dr. Petty in this case as well. This is work that they did together with Dwayne kind of taking the lead. Hedonic contingency is the feeling that's contingent upon circumstances in the environment. Now, they came out of the Petty lab, Dwayne did, and what they were looking at, obviously, is the elaboration likelihood model, because that's kind of core Petty lab stuff, and that is, how does persuasion work through the two channels, peripheral and central argument. You probably know about the elaboration likelihood model. Well, it then generates a lot of spin-off kind of research endeavors. In this case, what is the relationship of emotion to persuasion, or at least elaboration, that part of the persuasive process? And Dwayne offers us that sad moods are thought to increase elaboration. So when I'm sad, it increases my thinking about the situation. And he found in his research that the opposite was true of happiness. Happiness, then, people tend to want to think less. They don't want to elaborate on the information they're reviewing. And this kind of makes sense, right? And if I'll tie it to an action tendency kind of thing, I will offer that sadness kind of fixes us in our place, and this is enables us to take stock of our environment and kind of slow it down and think about what's going on. And this support, you know, can come tangentially from clinical psychologists in talking about clinical depression, and one of the components of being the rumination, the depressive rumination, which is thinking and thinking and thinking over again and not being able to stop thinking about negative aspects of one's life, right? So, and in happy moods, I don't want to think because it might blow it. I mean, if I think too much while I'm happy, I might think of something that makes me unhappy, so I don't even want to go there. Now, let's add that to the idea. Let's add stereotyping as a cognitive shortcut. I invoke stereotypes, which are essentially person or group schemas, if we need to use that word, right? Stereotyping allows me to not process, but just react, just respond on something that is stereotype as a pre-existing schema without further investigation. So the moods that generate lower levels of elaboration are expected to create greater reliance on stereotypic thinking. And there's exceptions, and we can find lots of exceptions, but all else being equal, right, mean stereotyping scores, if people are primed to be in a happy mood, then we see they are using more stereotypes. In a neutral or sad mood, we see people are elaborating more. They want to think, so the reliance on stereotypes goes down because they're a shortcut, right? Angry mood, then thinking diminishes as well, and stereotypes operate again. So interesting that anger and happiness work in the same way according to Bodenhausen and all. And again, this is another reason I'm not too fond of the idea of negative versus positive emotions, because I don't think it really tells us a lot about how cognition interacts with emotion. Here's a little picture, just in case you want to look at a little of our history. In 2007, I finished up graduate school, and I was teaching full-time in the social psychology department here. And we had a 100th anniversary party for Ohio State, 100 years of psychology, 2 days of presentations, talks, etc. Oh, it was a great time, dinners, and people from all over the world came back to Ohio State that had been students at Ohio State or taught at Ohio State. Everyone came back to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Ohio State psychology. It was a freaking awesome time. This picture is from there. So here's Rich Petty, and there's Dwayne Wegner, right? So Petty was, Wegner was a Petty student, right? And that's often how you kind of identify yourself at conferences. People want to know, hey, well, who did you study with? Who was your advisor, right? And it can be a source of prestige. I love it when I go to conferences because they ask, I haven't been a long time, but they say, well, who was your advisor? Who did you study with? And I get to say Marilyn Brewer, and they go, oh my God. Or I get to say Phil Tellock, and they say, oh my God, because they know these people and they have reputations. This is Christian Wheeler, and Christian Wheeler was about 2 years ahead of me in graduate school. Brilliant guy. He's at Stanford now. And he does a lot of work in marketing and those kinds of ideas, attitudes, right? Because these are attitudes people. And there's Joe Priester, who's collaborated with these guys. I don't have much interaction with Joe. We didn't overlap. But this is kind of the legacy, and this is how we kind of build our families, our academic families, just in case you're wondering. So let's talk a little more about hedonic contingency and some of the exceptions. Because once, hedonic contingency is floated as an idea, and establishes itself in the psychological or social psychological literature, then people will start finding boundary conditions. Boundary conditions are where the phenomenon doesn't operate any longer, it's not observed, or sometimes with certain boundary conditions we see a reversal of phenomenon. Tienza and Linton found that disgust did, but fear didn't necessarily lead to the effects. So different emotions may behave differently. Rosen et al. Suggests that the cultural value violation of emotions, disgust, contempt, etc., are arousing emotions that link to stereotype activation and then lower cognitive output. So disgust would be a great example, contempt, etc. Different emotions might facilitate stereotyping of different groups. Disgust facilitates gay men stereotypes, whereas anger seems to facilitate stereotyping of Americans, and that would obviously be by people in other places around the world. And let's face it, there's a lot of people that don't like America and are very angry at America quite often, and it facilitates that. So bottom line is there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot of research opportunities in this regard to further explore it. I want to offer that context matters, and let's talk about a couple people here. Will Maddox, right? And Maddox and I were in graduate school together. We were in the same cohort the same year, and we became very good friends. And I'm going to talk a little bit, just a little bit, about a study that I did. I began with Will Maddox, and then we pulled in collaborators. A strange study in the way we did this, because Will was getting ready to leave. I had a couple more years under my belt. He was getting ready to go up to Northwestern to do his postdoc up at the Kellogg School of Business up there, where our friend Derek Rucker, who I've talked about, was already up at Kellogg School. So Will, said to me, Mark, we should do a study together. And I said, that'd be cool, yeah. He said, we should do a study because it'd be really cool if we could do some studies and we could publish it and have both our names on the study. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it's a strange approach to researching something. So it was kind of asked backwards, because then, well, okay, so what should we research? What should we study? And we decided we would do some work in stereotyping and prejudice. We're both, kind of hugely familiar with the literature at that point in time. And so, but we said we want to do something different, because that's kind of like how we are, a little contrarian in nature. And we said, most research about stereotyping and prejudice is, here's a group, here's the negative aspects of the group, and this generates the negative stereotypes and justifies prejudice against that group, and those are the mechanisms that are studied. And we said, but what if, let's flip it around, what if a group has positive qualities? What if a group could be considered, let's say, better than we are? Then how would that operate? So it was kind of a novel approach to research, and we're pretty proud about that. So we used the idea of Asians as a model minority. And how did we come to this? Well, the idea is that Asians in the United States, right, Asians have, one of the lowest crime rates for ethnicity. They have one of the highest earned incomes. They have the best scholastic performance. So anytime you look at Asians in the United States, you go boom, 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 that they outperform other ethnic groups, including whites in the United States. The question is, though, how do then other groups perceive Asians? How do they stereotype Asians? And how does that affect their discrimination and prejudice towards Asians? So Asians that are perceived as competitors in an academic setting were viewed with envy, anger, fear, and hostility. They were viewed coldly, right? And we had a very simple paradigm. We asked people to imagine themselves, it was kind of a story situation, imagine themselves in a science class, and the way we manipulated through the story, that they were randomly assigned to conditions where they were partnered with an Asian, they were partnered with an African American, or they were partnered with a white person, or they were to work alone. So there was 4 experimental conditions into which people were randomly assigned, right? And when people were partnered with the Asians, ultimately they viewed Asians positively because they thought they would do better in the science class on their little paired project. Those who were paired with whites, African Americans, or felt that the majority of the class was Asians and they were working alone, felt at a disadvantage, and they viewed Asians coldly. So the idea is, if they were then thought to be partner on an assignment in a science class, they were viewed warmly. So if, and notice this is where we get to the context matters, if Asians, if I'm partnered with an Asian and we're doing science or math, the stereotype evoked is Asians are great at science and math, oh my God, I'll do better on the assignment and I love Asians. But if I'm in competition with Asians, if I'm in a class where it's graded on a curve and I'm partnered with a non-Asian, then I'm anxious that I won't do well and I view Asians coldly. So we thought it was fascinating that this kind of stuff flips around. So this is where we look at model minorities. Now, I'm sorry, I should talk about our other 2 collaborators for a minute. I think I skipped right ahead of that, and I would like to say Adam Galinsky was up at the Kellogg School as well, right? And he joined. Maddox and I we ran a couple studies here at Ohio State, and then he met Galinsky and Cootie, so he started working with them. We brought them into and kind of really expanded our perspective on this. And Amy had already been working in other areas as well, and as you know Amy Cootie from power posing, among other forms of research. So the second part of the collaboration was pretty broad and became virtual. Right? We also measured, and this is one of Maddox's ideas that he'd seen in other literature, and we used to measure warmth or coldness, and I want to bring it up as a dependent measure for its research purposes. We actually use a feeling thermometer, so at the end of the experiment people are asked how warmly or coldly do you feel towards Asians, and people actually mark then on the feeling thermometer how warm or cold they feel by drawing a line across it. And I know it sounds really stupid. What, you just draw a line somewhere along there? But the deal is, and think about how cool this is, then when we analyze the results, what do? We take a ruler and we stick it up to that line, and now we can actually quantify where they position the mark. I mean, it's a quantifiable, so it's a pretty cool measure. Anyway, let's get back to where we're going. Warmth then is one of two stereotype dimensions according to Cootie and others. That do we feel warmly or coldly? And that's one aspect of the content of our stereotypes, right? So it suggests two dimensions. That's the warmth. Groups as warm and friendly, or cold and unfriendly. And this can arise from the potential cooperation benefits. So in a cooperative effort, I view them warmly, as we saw in the previous study. In a competitive, then we view those people as cold. But then the second dimension is their level of competence. Because if I'm in competition but they're not competent and I'm likely to beat them, then the anxiety goes way down. But notice if I'm in competition and they're better than I am, as is with, let's say, a model minority, then I tend to view them negatively. Right? So we take these two ideas and then we can array the groups. So for Cootie's model, among others, what we see then is four dimensions of the stereotype content model. If it's high warmth and high competence, so I view these people as both warm and competent, the example group might be middle-class white people, right? And the emotion that's elicited, because we've got to get back to the emotion, might in this case then be admiration. And the behaviors then we might facilitate and be passive and active towards these. Now let's suppose we have high warmth and low competence. Let's see, it is Wednesday, this is noon, so here goes the test of the sirens. High warmth and low competence, the mentally challenged and or disabled, and the emotion that's elicited is pity. And active facilitation, right, but we might then engage in passive harm like limiting access or limiting job potential. Low warmth but high competence, right, might be Jews and Asians, and that is when we're in a competitive environment, because remember the context the context matters, and we see envy or anger. And then finally, low warmth, low competence. This might be welfare recipients or the homeless. We might express then contempt towards these people, and then we might actively and passively seek to harm them. Other illustrations along these same lines, because these competence and warmth dimensions have been quite popular. Here's one from Fisk et al., Susan Fisk, and you can see on this axis is warmth, low to high, and then we see on this axis competence, low to high, and where are the stereotypes, and now it allows us to look at a couple different types of prejudice. If we believe people are low in competence but high in warmth, then we demonstrate paternalistic prejudice. That is, we feel they're inferior, but we like them, so we're going to take care of them. This is also akin to benevolent sexism, another construct. So housewives, right, the elderly, the blind, the retarded, the disabled, people who clean our houses, we feel pity for them, right, and we want to take care of them. Now, contemptuous prejudice is when we have low warmth and low competence. So Hispanics, poor whites, poor blacks, welfare recipients might fall into this category, right? And often all we have to say to these, well, if you worked harder, you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We're not going to take care of you. Notice it's a very cold approach. It can be active harm, and the expectation is it's on them, right? In the middle, moderate competence, moderate warmth, what can we say? Sexy women, I don't know how the hell that got in there, especially next to Arabs. Okay, so yeah, the gay men, blue collar, Southerners. But then envious prejudice, and this is where we see lower levels of warmth, but high levels of competence, like Jews, Asians, right? Black professionals, then we might in fact be envious of these people and prejudiced that they might represent a threat, and then this can engender the intergroup anxiety. You can see that I presented kind of several separate ideas during this part of the module, and I think there's some future in people who want to come in and start synthesizing these ideas and build models that seek to synthesize these ideas. There might be some good opportunity at this point in time. Every once in a while, we need to create, kind of disparate ideas and explore those in their detail, kind of the splitter mentality. But then I think the era becomes ripe for lumpers, that is, who kind of synthesize all these ideas. So, model of relation, stereotype to intergroup emotion and behaviors then. So, belief about the group, and notice, belief about the group is supported by the narrative. And this goes back to what Allport was saying, as we discussed in the first two parts of this lecture. Economic threat, right? Well, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, notice the economic threat is very different. Asian Americans are going to own the world. Mexican Americans are a drag on the economy. That's the narrative story, right? That's the stereotype content, not something I endorse. The emotions generated then, so it's going to tie it all together, is anger, fear, disgust, and aggression becomes part of the idea. Now, it might be aggressive trade policies is one way to look at that, or building a wall, those kinds of things. Now, if it's a values threat, like gay men, right? Oh my God, if we have gay marriage, then it's going to be the erosion of our society, right? Or active feminists, so women need to know their place. You've heard all these stories. I'm not telling you anything new, right? So you can just go on down the list, but notice how then it ties the emotion. So the narrative applied to a group generates these emotions, which then give us our behavioral action tendency, that is our emotion action tendency. So it's kind of a nice summing up. And Cottrell and Newberg are both big supporters of image theory that look at this kind of macro level. Let's shut this one down, and we'll go to the final part. I believe, if I've not miscount, it'll be part 4.